The city, with its tall buildings and busy streets, was a reflection of its own contradictions. While some areas boasted luxury and prosperity, others seemed to have forgotten humanity, immersed in inequality and neglect. Between the signs of prosperity, there was a thin line where lives faded into invisibility. Among these shadows was Jorge, a middle-aged man, a former war veteran. After years of suffering and loss, he lived on the streets, walking among others, invisible to many, but carrying within him a past of bravery. That morning, the sun was beginning to heat up the streets when Carlos, an experienced police officer hardened by life's hardships, received the call. The mission was simple. A homeless man was causing a riot in a store in the city center. Carlos knew that many times that call was just an excuse to remove someone from the place, but he didn't question it. What mattered was that he was there to do his job. When he arrived at the place, he saw Jorge leaning against a wall of the store, trying to protect himself from the heat with a piece of paper. His disheveled appearance and tired look of someone who had seen too much caught Carlos's attention, but not in the way he should have. He saw him as just another problem, a worthless person with no right to occupy that space. With a firm step, Carlos approached Jorge and in an authoritative manner ordered him to leave immediately. "Get up, you have no right to stay here," Carlos ordered in a cold, impersonal voice. Jorge, though weakened, slowly stood up with trembling hands. He looked at the officer but did not say a word. The pride of a man who had already faced immeasurable battles in his life still led him to stand firm. However, when he tried to take a step back, Carlos stepped forward and pushed him hard without thinking about the consequences. "You didn't hear me, did you? You're wasting my time. Come on, get out of here now," Carlos said, his anger becoming more palpable. The push caused Jorge to fall to the ground and hit his head hard on the cement. A few passers-by stopped and looked, but no one dared to interfere. Carlos's eyes were fixed on Jorge without empathy. He didn't think about what he was doing, he just saw an object that he needed to remove. Jorge, in physical pain mixed with humiliation, tried to stand up, but his knees gave way. He was defeated, not only physically, but also spiritually. The man who had once been a war hero was now treated as a nuisance, a burden to society. Upon seeing Jorge's body on the ground, Carlos felt something stir inside him, but he quickly pushed it away. He didn't have time to reflect. The mission was accomplished and he would move on without caring about what he had left behind. However, the growing murmur of the few passers-by who witnessed the scene seemed to follow him, although he couldn't hear them. The scene of Jorge's attack quickly spread. An amateur video, filmed by one of the few people nearby, began to circulate on social media. The image of a police officer attacking a defenseless man, already lying on the ground, touched the community. It was a reflection of something much greater than Carlos's isolated violence. It was the brutality against the city's vulnerable and invisible people. Outrage took to the streets, and the incident quickly became a national issue. The image of Jorge, fallen and humiliated, was repeated tirelessly on the news. The pain he felt physically was now shared by thousands of people who saw in his humiliation a story of abandonment and a fight for dignity. Carlos, on the other hand, was beginning to face the consequences of his actions. Messages began to arrive from all sides. As he tried to justify himself to his co-workers and superiors, a part of him knew that something was wrong. Deep down, he believed that he was just doing his job, but something in his conscience began to question the methods he was using. He couldn't get Jorge's gaze out of his head, that gaze of someone who had already been defeated by life, but who, for some reason, still maintained his dignity. At home, the situation was equally tense. Marta, Carlos's wife, watched him silently as he prepared for another night of worship. She knew what was happening. The newspapers, the news, conversations among friends and family, everyone was talking about him. Carlos was the villain. the face of a systemic violence that he refused to admit to being a part of. He refused to accept that this was actually a reflection of the intolerance and arrogance that he so condemned in others. His only defense was that he was simply doing his job. But when he saw Marta's eyes, he knew he could hide no longer. Meanwhile, Jorge struggled to cope with his pain, both physical and emotional. The hospital where he was treated not only healed his wounds, but also rescued him from a place where he had been lost for so long. He was not simply a homeless person or a vagabond. He was a human being who served his country, who gave his life in a war that now seemed forgotten. With each passing day, more people began to recognize his story. Veterans, activists, and even former friends reached out to him and offered support and solidarity. They saw him not simply as a victim of police brutality, but as someone who fought for something greater. Jorge began talking to journalists and sharing his experience. Instead of seeing him as just a lost face, people began to see him for the man he was. A war veteran who, after losing everything, was still struggling to find meaning in his life. By telling his story, Jorge began to be seen as a symbol of resilience and bravery. His face now appeared on posters protesting police abuse and the unequal treatment of veterans. Suddenly, Jorge was no longer just a victim. He was someone who, through his pain, awakened the conscience of many. As outrage spread, the video of the attack became a manifesto, a call to reflect on the society that allows people like Jorge to be treated so cruelly. And in the midst of all this, Carlos found himself confronted with an uncomfortable reality. He had been the one who had caused her pain, but he didn't know how to deal with it. The repercussions of the incident with Jorge grew every day. The case gained attention on the streets, on social media, in protests, and even in the courts. The pressure on Carlos increased. He could no longer escape the shadow of the violence he had caused. His police superiors began to demand more detailed explanations, and he found himself at the center of an investigation that threatened his career. But the greatest pressure came from within. Contrary to what he had expected, the coldness with which he had treated the case began to disappear, leaving room for doubts, regrets, and a feeling of discomfort that he could no longer ignore. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jorge's face, dirty, hurt, but with a quiet dignity that touched him deeply. Carlos knew he couldn't deny reality much longer. He was beginning to wonder if this was really the person he wanted to be. Conversations inside the police station began to grow more tense. His colleagues expressed skepticism about what had happened, and the support he had seemed to evaporate as the situation worsened. Carlos began to distance himself from his family. Marta tried to talk to him, to understand his feelings, but he was lost in his own thoughts. He no longer knew if what he was doing was right. He felt like he was part of a completely corrupt system, and with each passing day, it became harder to find a justification for his actions. However, Jorge, even under medical care, was not free from emotional pain. He felt like a broken man, both physically and psychologically. However, something inside him was awakening with each new day. He began to understand that his fight was not only against the police officer who assaulted him, but against an entire system that saw him as invisible. With the support of his community, he decided that he would fight not only for his dignity, but also for all the others who, like him, were being treated like trash by society. Jorge began organizing support groups and connecting with other veterans who, like him, had been abandoned after their contributions. He knew that what had happened to him was not an isolated incident, but rather a reflection of something much larger. Most importantly, he knew that his voice, however wounded it was, now had power. I would not be another victim. He would make sure people heard his story, and he wanted Carlos to know that his aggression would not go unnoticed. When Carlos got the message that Jorge wanted to meet with him to talk, he felt a mix of dread and guilt. What would I say? What could he do to undo the damage he had done? He didn't know if he was ready to face the man he had hurt, but he knew he had to. The weight of the situation was becoming more and more unbearable, and he felt that the only way forward would be if he faced it head-on. A meeting was scheduled between the two. Jorge, with a calm face and the strength of someone who has survived much longer, and Carlos, tense, with his heart beating fast, knowing that there was no more room for lies or excuses. It was time to face what had happened, to look into each other's eyes and understand where they stood. The encounter between Carlos and Jorge was not just a physical confrontation between two men, but the beginning of a tense and emotional dialogue, a clash between the past and the present, between regret and the search for redemption. The atmosphere was one of palpable tension, with both parties willing to face their respective realities, but without knowing exactly how the communication process would take place. Carlos, still deeply affected by the repercussions of his act, felt a lump in his throat when he looked at Jorge, who seemed to be the complete opposite of his image. Jorge's calm contrasted with Carlos's restlessness, who didn't know where to start. He sat at the table, trying to appear confident, but his eyes betrayed his inner turmoil. Jorge, in turn, maintained an upright posture, his eyes fixed on Carlos with an intensity that seemed to go beyond his simple physical presence. There was something more there than the figure of a wounded man. It was the presence of a warrior, someone who had faced battles much greater than a simple, immediate confrontation. "Did you know who I was before that day?" Jorge asked in a calm but firm voice. "Or did you see me as just another black man on the street, with no name, no history, just a shadow to be discarded?" Carlos felt a shiver run down his spine. Jorge's words were not a simple accusation, but a deep reflection on what he represented within the police system, something he had never thought about until then. He knew nothing about Jorge, except what his quick glance had allowed him to perceive. A man who seemed lost, but at the same time someone with an uncompromising strength that was now revealed. The silence that followed the question was heavy, and Carlos was unable to answer without seeming even more distant from the reality that Jorge was living. "I was just doing my job," Carlos said, more to himself than to Jorge. The words came out of his mouth as an attempt to convince himself that there was some kind of plausible justification. But when he looked at Jorge, he realized that there were not enough explanations to cover the magnitude of what had happened. Jorge, with a sigh, did not look away. "You were not the only one who did your job. Many of us had our lives destroyed while others did their job." He paused, as if the pain he felt was a history he had carried for a long time, a burden that could not be alleviated with simple apologies. "I served too. I was a soldier. I did my job. But no one remembers me. No one sees the pain I carry inside me." Jorge's words cut through the silence with precision. Carlos felt a growing weight on his chest. He tried to understand, but the barriers between them were deep. How could a man who fought to defend his country be treated this way, neglected and humiliated by the same society that should have shown him gratitude? The disconnect between what Carlos thought was his reality and Jorge's seemed to grow, and he could no longer maintain his stance as a defender of the system. "What do you expect from me now?" Carlos asked, his voice shaking. He was completely disarmed, emotionally exposed, before a man who, despite all his pain, kept his dignity intact. Jorge was silent for a moment, his hands resting on the table. His response was not a plea for forgiveness, but a demand for recognition. "I don't need your pity or your empty excuses. I need things to change. Don't let what happened to me happen again. You have the power to do that. You are part of this, not just as a police officer, but as someone who can influence something bigger." Carlos looked at Jorge, realizing for the first time the magnitude of his words. He wasn't asking for revenge or sympathy. Jorge was demanding the basics: humanity, justice, and recognition. He wanted to see real change. And perhaps for the first time, Carlos began to understand that what was at stake was not just his personal fate, but the impact of his actions on the lives of the people he had sworn to protect. As the meeting came to a close, a sense of responsibility weighed heavily on Carlos. He knew that the journey to redemption would not be easy, but something inside him had shifted. It would not be enough to apologize. He had to act. And somehow, he began to see that this meeting was not just about the attack on Jorge. It was an opportunity for him, Carlos, to look in the mirror and see beyond the uniform, beyond the weapons, beyond the authority. It was an opportunity to re-evaluate his role in a system that, as he now understood, was in desperate need of transformation. Carlos was walking down the street that night, his head full of conflicting thoughts. Meeting Jorge had moved him in a way he couldn't fully explain. Jorge's words, full of pain but also wisdom, had stuck in his mind. He knew something had changed, but he didn't know how to apply this new perspective to his daily life. When he got home, Carlos entered the house quietly. Marta was waiting for him in the living room. She could tell right away that he wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't just the tired expression on his face or the tense way he was sitting. There was something different in his eyes. I knew he was dealing with something much bigger than Jorge's case. Something inside him seemed to have broken, but at the same time, something new seemed to be being born. "Did you talk to him?" Marta asked in a low voice. Carlos nodded slowly, not speaking for a moment. He wanted to tell him everything, but the words weren't ready to come out yet. There was a lot he still didn't understand about what had happened. But one thing was clear: he could no longer ignore the injustices he faced, nor his own role within that narrative. "I heard what he said," Carlos replied, his voice breaking. "He didn't ask me for mercy. He just wants justice. And to be honest, I don't know how. But I know I need to do something to change this." Marta looked at him with an understanding expression, but also with concern. She knew that Carlos was at a turning point. He feared what this would mean for him because he knew how deeply he was involved in the police structure and how painful and complicated it could be to change that system. In the days that followed, Carlos took time off from work. He wasn't sick, but he was deep in self-reflection. I knew that the truth about what had happened to Jorge wasn't an isolated story. It was part of something bigger, a system of oppression that he had been conditioned to accept as part of his daily life. But now, after meeting Jorge, he could no longer ignore the flaws in that system. He felt lost, but he knew that his journey toward justice was just beginning. Meanwhile, Jorge was taking concrete action. He got involved with activists and groups fighting for changes in the police system and became an active voice in the fight against police brutality. His wounds were healing, but the emotional and psychological pain still haunted him. However, he did not let this discourage him. He knew that his fight was now bigger than himself. It was a fight for structural changes that, if successful, could save the lives of many others who found themselves in the same situation as him. Jorge began organizing peaceful protests, marches, and events that brought attention to the unfair treatment of black people and veterans. His message was clear: the system needed to be reformed. He wanted justice not only for himself, but for everyone else who had suffered at the hands of abusive police officers. Carlos, still conflicted, began to observe these events from afar. He wanted to be there, but he feared that his presence would be seen as an attempt at self-promotion. Doubt plagued him. He didn't know how, but he felt he needed a way to get involved without seeming like he was just trying to redeem his own guilt. That's when he decided to do something he hadn't thought possible. At an internal police meeting, he stood up, and, for the first time, spoke openly about what had happened to Jorge. He admitted that what he had done was wrong. He spoke about the system, the way he had been conditioned to view certain types of people in a dehumanizing way, and how he was ready to start changing. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for an opportunity to change the system from the inside out. The reaction was mixed. Some of his colleagues looked at him with suspicion, others with shame, but a seed of change was being planted there. Carlos knew that the road would be long, that he would have to face resistance both inside and outside the police station. But for the first time, he felt that he was on the right path. Meanwhile, Jorge continued his path of activism, stronger than ever. I knew the road ahead would be full of challenges, but I was prepared. The fight for justice would not end until the system was transformed, and he was determined to be a key part of that transformation.